All right, today we are digging into an absolutely epic story from the book of Exodus. I mean, this thing has everything: a divine contract, a crisis that nearly blows the whole deal up, and a central mystery that's fascinated people for centuries. And that is, what does it actually mean for a perfect, unchanging God to change his mind?
Okay, so when you think of a contract, what comes to mind? It's usually pretty transactional, right? If you do this for me, I'll give you that. But what if a contract was flipped completely on its head? That's exactly what we're going to look at with the Sinai Covenant. It's this foundational agreement that isn't based on what you promised to do, but on what has already been done for you. It's a total game changer.
So, let's get into what makes this contract so special. This thing wasn't just a list of rules dropped from the sky. It was actually based on a very specific kind of legal document from the ancient world. Think of it as a treaty between a powerful king and his people. But, and this is the key, it has a massive twist.
Now check this out. The key to the whole thing is the order of these steps. It's absolutely crucial. First, the king says who he is. Then, and this is the part you can't miss, he reminds them what he's already done for them. He talks about the rescue. The rules, the stipulations, they only show up after that act of grace. So it's not obey me to get saved, it's you've already been saved, therefore this is how we're going to live. You see how that order just flips the entire dynamic?
Yeah, and the scholar Gordon Wenham just nails it with this quote. The whole point is that the law was never meant to be a way to earn salvation. It's not some kind of ladder you climb to get God to like you. No, it's the response to a rescue that's already happened. The entire relationship is built on grace from the get-go.
All right, so now that this grace-based contract is established, you have to ask, what's the ultimate goal? I mean, it can't just be about following rules, right? And it's not. It's about relationship. The plan, believe it or not, was for God to actually move into the neighborhood.
And that's where the Tabernacle comes in. The next few chapters of Exodus get into these super detailed, almost mind-numbing instructions for building this special tent. And honestly, it can feel like you're reading an ancient IKEA manual. But I'm telling you, these aren't just architectural plans, they are the literal blueprints for the climax of the entire redemption story.
I love this quote from the theologian Alec Moyer because he just makes it so clear. He says, it's like God coming to live at number 10. Now, since he's British, he's talking about 10 Downing Street, right? The Prime Minister's residence. Imagine the leader of your country not living in some guarded mansion, but pitching a tent right in the middle of your town square. That's the idea. The king wasn't staying in some far-off palace. He was moving right in with his people.
But this is where the story takes a hard right turn. You have to get this mental picture. At the exact same moment that God is laying out these beautiful, intimate plans for living with his people, something is going terribly, terribly wrong down at the bottom of the mountain.
I mean, look at this contrast. It's like a tale of two mountainsides. Up top, you've got Moses receiving God's blueprint for his presence, this incredible gift. And then down below, you've got the people who are tired of waiting, anxious, and deciding, you know what, we'll just figure out our own way to get God's presence. They're taking matters into their own hands.
They just couldn't wait. Moses has been up on the mountain for 40 days, and that was just too long. So out of fear and impatience, they go and build a golden calf. I mean, think about it. The ink on that grace-based contract is barely even dry, and they've already shattered it. They broke the deal almost immediately.
Okay, but we need to get the nature of this violation right, because it's a little subtle. This wasn't the people saying, forget Yahweh, we want a new God. In fact, their leader, Aaron, he literally announces a festival to Yahweh. So what was the sin? It was a direct violation of the second commandment, don't make an idol. They were trying to worship the right God, but in a totally wrong, forbidden way. They tried to create a visible, controllable symbol for the invisible, uncontrollable God.
So, as you can imagine, God's reaction to this is not mild. It's swift, and it is severe. He basically says he's going to wipe out the very people he just rescued. And this moment right here, it throws us headfirst into one of the toughest, most challenging questions in this entire story.
I mean, God just lays it on the line. He tells Moses, now leave me alone so I can destroy them. He's ready to just wipe the slate clean and start over with Moses. But Moses, instead of stepping aside to save his own skin, he does the exact opposite. He steps right into the line of fire.
And what Moses does next is just incredible. He doesn't try to bargain. He doesn't make excuses for the people. Instead, he appeals directly to God himself, to God's own character. He basically makes three arguments. First, he says, these are your people. Remember how you brought them out of Egypt with your power? Second, he appeals to God's reputation, asking, what are the Egyptians going to say? That you rescued them just to kill them? And third, and this is the big one, he reminds God of his own unbreakable promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel.
And then comes the pivot point of the whole drama. In response to this bold prayer for Moses, the Bible says that the Lord relented. He relented from the disaster he had planned. And that one little word, relented, has sparked thousands of years of discussion and debate.
Because this is the tension, right? How can a God who is perfect, who is all-knowing, who is unchanging, how can that God relent or change his mind? It seems like a contradiction. Well, to even start to unpack this, we need to add a kind of clunky but really useful word to our vocabulary.
And that word is anthropomorphism. Okay, I know, it's a mouthful, but think of it like its more famous cousin, anthropomorphism. That's when we talk about God having human features like the hand of God. Well, anthropomorphism is when the Bible describes human emotions or feelings to God. It's not saying God literally gets angry or sad like we do. It's the Bible's way of explaining God's actions and his relationship with us in a way that our limited human minds can actually understand.
You know, a military analogy can actually be super helpful here. Think of it like this. God has an ultimate, unchanging strategy, his big picture plan for redemption. That never, ever changes. But the tactics he uses on the ground, the methods he uses to carry out that strategy, those can and do change, often in direct response to what we do, like prayer.
So the big point here is that when the Bible says God relented, it doesn't mean he's fickle or indecisive. It's actually the opposite. It's a demonstration of his perfectly consistent and unchanging character, a character that by its very nature responds to the prayers of his people. It means prayer actually matters. God isn't some static, distant force. He's a person in a real, dynamic relationship with us. And that's the powerful idea this ancient story leaves us to wrestle with. What does it mean for a God who is unchanging to also be a God who responds? It shows us a God whose ultimate plans are absolutely unshakable, but whose relationship with us is real, it's dynamic, it's responsive. Maybe the paradox is the point. He is unchanging, and it's precisely because of his unchanging, faithful nature that he always listens and always responds.